This is a lecture introducing you to Israeli elections. It was recorded on March 10th, 2021. The Israeli governmental system includes a legislature, the Knesset, which has 120 members. Currently, Israel is on its 23rd Knesset since the first elections in 1948. The executive branch is called the government. We would call it the cabinet in the United States. However, the cabinet has much more of a role because the cabinet as a whole creates government policy, not simply the prime minister. Or to put it differently, the prime minister governs within a coalition, and so the views of the individual members of the government have much more weight, unlike the United States, where the president is the boss and the secretary of state or transportation or whatever put into play the policies of the president. The Knesset is elected. The president of the state of Israel is largely a figurehead. One of his most important political roles is to ask somebody to form a government. Typically, it's the person who receives the most votes, or I should say the person whose party receives the most votes, or the next party who receives the next most votes. The current government is the 35th, and it has 27 ministers. Elections happen every 4 years, but they can happen earlier if the budget is not passed on time. That's the reason for the current elections. It can also happen if the Knesset votes to dissolve itself and hold early elections. This can happen for a number of reasons. The president of the state is also allowed to call for early elections if there is no government. There may be other reasons why the president can call for early elections. In any case, the coalition agreement may include a call for early elections, as is the case in the current government. Had there not been early elections now, the Knesset would have been dissolved in 36 months, not in 4 years. What happens when no governing coalition can be formed after an election? Well, this has happened twice in the recent past, never happened before that. In April of a year ago, the Knesset voted to dissolve itself because Netanyahu was unable to form a government and did not want to give his chief rival, Benny Gantz, a chance. He was able to push through a resolution to dissolve the Knesset. He was not able to actually form a government. The new elections that happened as a result also resulted in a stalemate. That time, the president of Israel gave the mandate to Gantz and then to Netanyahu. No one was able to form a government. There was a 21-day period mandated by the Israeli constitution, after which they had to go to new elections. The Knesset voted on a law and set the next elections. Interestingly, the government can fall either by a no confidence vote, that happened only once in the history of the state, or because the coalition dissolves and is unworkable and somebody withdraws. And the Knesset does not have to call for new elections as a result if somebody can form a new government. Israelis vote for one political party. It's actually a list of candidates, a slate of candidates put forth by that party. The slates need to get 3.25% of the overall vote in order to get a place in the Knesset. That's the current threshold. It was changed several years ago. Years and years ago, the threshold was 1% and then 2%. It was possible to have a single member of Knesset. These days, the normative expectation is 4 members of Knesset minimum for each slate. I believe it is technically possible for the mathematics to work out so that a party gets 3.25% of the overall vote, but does not get 4, but only 3 Knesset members. In any case, this threshold has forced a number of parties to combine so that the first party gets place 1, the second party gets place 2, or however they decide to organize the slate. Some parties have primaries, some parties have the secretariat, the leading committee of the party choose all the positions in the Likud. The most recent discussion was to keep the same list as before, but to give Netanyahu, the prime minister and the leader of the Likud, roles to put people in certain places. If polls suggest that a certain party is going to get, for example, 25 seats to 30 seats, the top 25 seats are considered to be fairly safe. The next 5 seats are considered to be in contention, and anything more than 30 are unlikely unless there is a landslide. And there is a lot of jockeying for so-called safe seats. There are a number of ways you can see what the lists are. Wikipedia has a fairly good list. The Israeli Election Committee, it's called Bechirot 24, has a full list of candidates. Unfortunately, I don't think it's available in Latin characters in English. I did put a list of all the parties into this PowerPoint, and you can see all the names. There are 39 parties that are vying for a position. Some of them are fairly broad. Some of them are very narrow. The joint list is a list of several Arab parties who combined their lists in order to gain representation in the Knesset. The Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu's party, is on the lower left-hand side of this list. Benny Gantz's party is blue and white. It's on the upper left-hand side. And there you go. Here is the remainder of the list. You'll notice 2 Hebrew letters, sometimes 3 or 4 Hebrew letters next to each one. That is the symbol of each party. Here is an example of what a party list looks like. In this particular case, the Likud list shown in Wikipedia has 51 members. You'll also notice a lot of them are in blue, indicating that nearly all of them have English language Wikipedia articles about them. You can read something about who they are and what they stand for. When the Israeli voter goes into the ballot box, this is what he or she sees. An array, in this case, of 40 slips of paper with 1, 2, 3, and in one case, 4 Hebrew letters as the symbol of the party and the name of the party below. These ballot boxes are also available in Arabic characters. The voter is given an envelope, goes into the room behind the screen, picks one and only one, puts it in the envelope, puts the envelope in the ballot box in public. That is the voting process in a nutshell. On election day, the votes that were for slates that did not reach the threshold basically are thrown out. The total number is divided by 120. This gives you the threshold for an individual seat. It is a whole integral number. It always leaves some leftover votes. Israeli law has a fairly complicated system of distributing the leftover votes. Simplest way of putting it is that the largest parties may very well gain 1 or 2 seats from the leftover votes. After the members of Knesset have been determined by the election committee, the president meets with all the factions with representation in the Knesset to discuss their recommendations. Whom should he ask to form a government? Whom should he ask to be prime minister? Prime minister must be a member of Knesset. The prime minister typically is the leader of the largest or next largest party in the Knesset. The president will hold these meetings and give a 42-day mandate to a member of Knesset. The president can extend this for 2 weeks. There are all sorts of other things that can happen. When all else fails, the president offers a 21-day period in which any member of Knesset can attempt to form a government. Most recently, this happened, it did not work, and new elections were called. Typically, coalitions need to have a majority. It's not impossible to have a minority government with 60 or even 59 votes, but not anybody voting, not as many people voting against. Doesn't happen very often, and it's not very stable. Notice that there are 120 representatives in the Knesset. It seems to me that the threshold of 30 means that the leading party, actually a little bit more than 30, can be the majority in the government. Less than 30, 31, 32 means that within the government, even the leading party is not a majority. This gives you an indication of how strong the small parties are in forming the coalitions. The current president has held these meetings on a very open basis, and the recommendations are public, and they can be treated as electoral votes. The current government, the 35th government, Gantz came out ahead, 61 to 58 votes. Notice that only one member of Knesset refused to give his vote, as it were, his recommendation for whom the president should appoint. Gantz was unable to form a government. Netanyahu arranged for 72 members of Knesset to sign a letter asking the president to task Netanyahu to form the government. Netanyahu formed a unity government together with Gantz on a rotation basis. Netanyahu would be president for 18 months, prime minister. Gantz would be prime minister for 18 months, and then there would be new elections. Unfortunately, they were unable to pass a budget on time, which automatically calls for new elections. What will be the results on March 23rd? Well, all the polls show that Likud is going to come out on top. This is Netanyahu's party. All the polls that I've seen suggest that Likud is unlikely to pass more than a threshold of more than 25% of the members of Knesset. Most recent polls, under 30 mandates. Pre-election polling, when voters are asked, whom do you prefer out of a large list of candidates, Netanyahu is strongly favored. But when they have one-on-one, whom do you prefer, Netanyahu or Gantz, Netanyahu or Saar, another leading candidate? Netanyahu's lead is not all that strong. This suggests to me that Netanyahu may very well have troubles forming a government no matter what happens, although most Israelis assume that whatever government it will be, Netanyahu will be the leader. It will not be very stable, and there will either be a new government or even new elections sometime well before the 4-year mandate of the Knesset. What's next? What are the ramifications? Netanyahu will continue to be a big issue, if not the biggest issue in Israeli politics, that is subject to a kind of debate. The large issue in Israeli politics are things like security and maintaining peace with neighbors and diplomacy. Unfortunately, internal social issues have not usually played as large a role in Israeli electoral politics. The Likud is a center-right or increasingly a right-wing party. Its heritage is free market, liberalization of government controls, and under the Likud, the gap between rich and poor, for example, has become greater. Under the Likud governments, there's been more complaints about social disenfranchisement by the lower middle class and the working class, but many of those support the Likud very strongly on ideological grounds. So the Likud continues to win elections. Netanyahu gets good marks for his vaccine policy with COVID and for his diplomacy. Religious and secular issues, not always so clear. Politics relating to the Arabs and to the Palestinians, very controversial. And as I said, social issues are very controversial. And we'll see what happens. Netanyahu is under indictment for a number of bribery and corruption cases. And many of the people in the electorate are voting against Netanyahu or voting for some of the splinter parties on the right wing for that reason. My guess, as I said, Netanyahu will come out with the most votes. It will not be as easy as it might seem to form a government. Neither the government nor the Knesset will be stable. And I would agree with many in the Israeli electorate that the government, and probably not even the Knesset, will last for its full term. Thank you very much.